alternative subcultures are often targeted with violence and bullying simply because they're different and don't fit the mainstream. That's something 20-year-old Sophie Lancaster and her boyfriend Rob Maltby knew all too well. They were two intelligent, sweet, and incredibly sensitive people part of the gothic scene. They never caused any trouble, but they were often harassed by people who did. And one day, that would end in tragedy. Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, everyone. And welcome to the very first video on this channel, Soft-Spoken True Crime. I plan to upload a video once a week in which I discuss a specific crime case. I absolutely love doing research and deep dives into true crime cases and have been doing that for years. And I finally decided to share this with the world here on YouTube. I do want to give a heads up that the cases I'm going to talk about in these videos are not the most pleasant stories. They are shocking stories. So if you can't handle that and you are younger than 12 years old, I would not recommend watching this video. On another note, I think it would be fun to give a shout out in every video to someone who left a comment on the previous video. So please leave a comment to let me know your thoughts on this video. I'm very open to feedback. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to my channel if you are curious about the cases that I would discuss in future videos. The case I'll present to you guys today is absolutely horrifying. It's not just about violence. It's about how people treat others who are different. People who act or dress differently, who have other interests than the mainstream and are bullied because of it. Sophie Lancaster and Rob's story, it's the kind that gives me chills. This one really gets under your skin. The level of violence and aggression involved makes me sick to my stomach. This story is important and it needs to be told, so I'll be telling you the full story. Sophie Lancaster was born on the 26th of November 1986 in Lancashire, England. So yes, this case takes place in the United Kingdom. Her parents were Sylvia and John Lancaster. She grew up in the Rossendale Valley, which is truly a beautiful area with steep hills, old houses, little rivers. It's just gorgeous, surrounded by nature. As a little girl, Sophie was always shy, a true introvert who needed her own space. In groups, she always observed first before engaging. But when she was with the right people, she could be very spontaneous. She was always a very sensitive, kind girl with her heart in the right place. Besides that, Sophie was also very intelligent. She was a smart girl who loved books and was always walking around with a book in her hands. She had a very strong will. Around the age of 12, she started to change a little, or at least her appearance did. The real Sophie started to come out, the one who had always been inside. She stayed with a friend for 6 weeks, and when she came home, she suddenly had dyed dark hair and alternative clothing. Her mother was surprised for a moment, but actually thought it was great. She was like, "Go for it. It's awesome that you dare to express yourself. And you look great." Her mom was just happy that Sophie seemed to be coming out of her shell and finding her own thing. And it wasn't just a phase for Sophie. She loved the music, made new friends, and found a whole friend group in the gothic scene where she felt completely at home. When she was 20, she was still that same Sophie. At that time, she had black locks, sometimes with bright green ribbons woven through. She also had a period where her locks had red strands mixed in. Sophie had quite a few piercings, over 20 total. Piercings in her lips, her septum, and a few here, a few there. She also had stretched earlobes, tunnels as they're called. Now we're in 2007, and 20-year-old Sophie's life is going well. She's dating Rob Maltby, who's 1 year older than her. He's 21. And he has a very similar, unique clothing style. They met each other through the gothic scene, and by then they had already been in a relationship for 3 years. They were living together in a small apartment in the center of a town called Backup. Backup is near where Sophie grew up. It's located more or less in the middle of the UK. Their apartment was above a youth center and a few shops. Backup was a very familiar place for Sophie. She'd grown up nearby and even went to school there for a while, so she knew the area quite well. Rob was studying art at an academy at that time, and Sophie was taking a gap year. She planned to start studying English in September. Her dream was to work with troubled youth later, which is tragically ironic. As for Rob's appearance, naturally, he had reddish, pinkish hair, but he almost always dyed it dark brown or completely black, sometimes adding colorful streaks. His hair was usually shoulder length or ear length, often a little wavy and messy. That was just his style. He has several piercings too. If you saw Sophie and Rob together, they looked absolutely perfect for each other. Like Sophie, Rob was incredibly kind, wouldn't hurt a fly, and very creative with his art. He was introverted and sensitive, just like Sophie. They were really quite similar. They never really got into trouble themselves, but as you can imagine, they stood out quite a bit in Backup. And because of that, they sometimes ended up in uncomfortable situations. Backup struggled a lot with youth, usually boys, who drank a lot, hung around the area, did drugs, and just looked for problems. And violence was becoming more common. Backup used to be a fairly quiet village, but that was starting to change. Many young people were out on the streets, looking for victims or trouble, and Sophie and Rob were often their targets. Rob, for example, had already been assaulted once while out celebrating Sophie's birthday. He was attacked and hit on the head. Super intense, all because of how he dressed. You'll find it heartbreaking that people judge others like that just because they stand out. I don't understand it, and I never will. Just because you dress differently or like different things, because you want to be yourself, that's horrible. And the way people react to it, especially with goths, is completely wrong. People often have this false image, as if there's something dark or evil about it. But most people in alternative subcultures are actually very sensitive, creative, artistic people who wouldn't hurt anyone. Their appearance just gives others the wrong impression, which is totally unfair. Thankfully, Sophie and Rob were surrounded by a group of friends who were just like them, with the same interests, the same style, and unfortunately, they experienced the same harassment. Even the girls in their group were often approached by nasty people or beaten up. It's terrible. So we're in 2007. It's summer, and on Friday evening, the 10th of August 2007, Sophie and Rob went to hang out at a friend's house. Around 9 p.m., they headed over to his place, located on the outskirts of Backup, where he lived with his dad. They just had a cozy evening, watching a movie, having some snacks and drinks, chatting, just hanging out. Around 11:40 p.m., Sophie and Rob left. But they didn't head straight home. They first planned to stop by a small park. Before that, they made a quick stop at a gas station that had a small convenience store still open. They needed to buy some cigarettes. Since this was one of the only places still open late at night, there were quite a few teens hanging around there. Sophie and Rob had been there before, so they probably recognized some faces. They chatted a bit, shared a few of their newly bought cigarettes with others, and then continued walking. About an hour later, around 1 a.m., they arrived at the entrance to the park. This park was located on the south side of Backup. There, they ran into a few teenagers, likely aged between 14 and 16, who they might have recognized somewhat. They walked with them into the park, heading toward the skate park area. This park also had a small skate park inside it. The teens they met weren't part of their gothic scene. They may have only known them by face. It's unclear exactly how well they knew them. I couldn't find any clear sources on that. But it was probably just a distant acquaintance. That skate park they were walking toward was a real hotspot, especially at night. Large groups of young people gathered there. When Sophie and Rob arrived, there were about 10 more people hanging around. The vibe was really nice and relaxed. They chatted with everyone. The girls were curious about Sophie's appearance. One girl even took a photo with her. Sophie was used to getting that kind of attention, but it was all friendly this time. She enjoyed explaining her style and sharing who she was. It was never a problem for her. The atmosphere was easygoing, calm, and cozy. Everyone was chatting, and there didn't seem to be any tension. But at the same time, some boys nearby were already planning something horrific. They had already noticed Sophie and Rob and quietly hyped each other up to attack them. They'd clearly been drinking and were looking to cause trouble, literally looking for a fight. This group of boys already had a reputation in the area for causing problems. We're talking about 5 very young boys, and I was honestly shocked when I read how young they were. Among them were 15-year-old Ryan Herbert and 15-year-old Brandon Harris. Ryan and Brandon were no strangers to police. They had been in trouble many times before and were well known to the justice system. Other people usually kept their distance from these boys because they were known as extremely aggressive bullies. And they targeted people who were vulnerable, people who didn't have friends nearby to defend them. They'd beat people up badly. Then there was 17-year-old Daniel Mallet, 16-year-old Joseph Holm, and his 15-year-old brother, Danny Holm. So those are the 5 boys involved. Many other teens were actually afraid of this group. They had a reputation for being violent and aggressive. Apparently, they didn't like the way Sophie and Rob looked. They called them goths and moshers. But instead of just leaving them alone, like they should have, they were actively looking to pick a fight. One of the boys was overheard quietly saying something like, "Let's go for it. We'll beat them up." Brandon, the 15-year-old, seemed to be the one leading this. He was hyping the others up and encouraging them to go after Sophie and Rob. At that point, Sophie and Rob were just chatting with others, taking photos, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Suddenly, someone shouted that they were going to hit them. They came straight at them, and everything escalated in seconds. "Let's start with Rob," they said. He was the first target. Out of nowhere, 15-year-old Brandon Harris hit Rob hard in the face. Or, actually, it was more like a punch, not just a slap. Rob stumbled backwards and started laughing. He really didn't understand what was happening. Maybe he thought it was a joke at first and tried to laugh it off, hoping to calm the situation. But then, several of the boys started punching Rob in the face, one after another. And when he fell to the ground, it still wasn't enough for them. They kept going. They repeatedly kicked him in the face again and again with full force. Then, 15-year-old Ryan Herbert grabbed Rob, mocking him, asking if he needed an ambulance. Like, "Hey, do you need an ambulance, mate?" "Just incredibly cruel," Rob replied. "No, I don't." And Ryan responded by punching him again. It was an explosion of violence. "Sophie, as Rob's girlfriend stood there helplessly, terrified that this was going way too far. She tried to protect Rob. She screamed at the boys, begging them to stop, but it didn't help. Meanwhile, Rob was lying there, defenseless on the ground. He wasn't fighting back anymore, because he had already lost consciousness. And what these boys did could easily have turned fatal. Attacking someone is awful enough, but kicking someone who's already unconscious and lying on the ground, it just kept escalating. At some point you wonder, what does it even take to make them stop? But even then, they weren't done. They kept kicking Rob, especially targeting his head. They even jumped on his head. I get such horrific images in my head just thinking about it. And imagine being Sophie in that moment. Your partner is lying there, completely defenseless, and you can't do anything. You try to pull them off him, but it's useless. There were plenty of other teens standing around, watching. Again, we're talking about 14 to 16-year-olds just frozen, watching this happen. They weren't laughing. This wasn't like what we sometimes see nowadays, where people pull out their phones to film and laugh about it. No, many of them were really disturbed. Some tried to intervene and yelled at the boys to stop. Some even tried to physically pull them away, but the outburst of violence was so intense that there was no stopping it. Others stood there, frozen, terrified that if they did something, they'd be the next victims. The boys were daring each other to continue, making it feel unstoppable. Sophie made the incredibly brave decision to protect Rob with her own body. She knelt down beside him, leaned over him, and cradled his head on her lap. She gently spoke to him, telling him everything was going to be okay. How courageous is that? She literally threw herself in the middle of the attack to protect him, over and over again. There she sat, holding her boyfriend's head, whispering comforting words, thinking the boys were finally done. But they weren't. Brendan Harris, the one who had started everything, took a running start and kicked Sophie hard from behind. From that moment on, Sophie became the main target. The boys now turned their full attention to her while she was still trying to comfort Rob. And the violence they used on Sophie was even worse than what they had done to Rob. Again, they focused on her head, kicking her continuously, full force, without stopping. They jumped on her. They stomped on her. They even walked over her head and body. It's incredibly traumatic for anyone who was there and saw this happening right in front of them. Right from the beginning, people watching knew this was very, very bad. While this was happening, two very young witnesses, a 14-year-old girl and a 15-year-old boy, had the courage to call the police. They called the emergency number, but the girl begged the dispatcher not to mention her name because she was terrified that the attackers would come after her. She was truly scared, but still brave enough to make the call. They stood at the side, watching as the boys kept viciously attacking Rob and Sophie. I really admire the courage it took to make that call. After all, the boys could have easily turned on them too. Calling the police was extremely risky. In total, they called the emergency services 3 times because the situation kept escalating and it took so long for help to arrive. One of those emergency calls is even available online. You can hear a portion of it where the violence is still happening in the background. You hear people shouting at the boys to stop. Others tried to pull at their sleeves, but nothing worked. The violence was completely out of control. The 15-year-old boy who was standing next to the girl also called the police. He emphasized how urgent the situation was, saying things like, "I don't think they're going to make it. They're dying." One of the witnesses described on the phone how Rob and Sophie were lying there like mannequins, lifeless, not moving, with blood everywhere. The first emergency call was made at 1:17 a.m., but it took nearly 15 minutes for the ambulance to finally arrive, even though it was less than a mile away. For some reason, the ambulance crew struggled to locate the right park. That delay was devastating, because while the emergency call was happening, the attack was still ongoing. Meanwhile, the boys ran off after finishing their brutal assault on Sophie. If the ambulance had gotten there sooner, who knows, maybe Sophie's injuries wouldn't have been so severe. At 1:32 a.m., the ambulance finally arrived. The police were still trying to locate the right spot and didn't arrive until 12 minutes after the ambulance, so about 1:45 a.m. Both Rob and Sophie were rushed to the hospital. Their injuries were so severe that the paramedics couldn't even tell if they were male or female. Meanwhile, that group of 5 boys was still hanging around nearby, acting all cheerful. As they walked around the area, they ran into 2 more 15-year-olds and bragged to them about what they had just done. Ryan told the 2 teens that there were 2 dead moshers lying in the park, and we did that. They laughed, celebrated, jumped around, and were completely proud of what they had done. After that, they went back to the same gas station where Rob and Sophie had bought cigarettes earlier that night. There, they ran into someone they knew and once again bragged that they had just beaten someone up. Joseph Hume, one of the boys, had stolen Rob's phone during the attack and even handed it to the person they met, like some kind of prize. "Here, take his phone." During the attack, quite a few people had witnessed what happened. Thanks to those witnesses, the police were able to get very good descriptions of the attackers. Using those witness statements, the police were quickly able to identify the 5 suspects. The boys, who were between 15 and 17 years old, were arrested within hours. 10 hours after the attack, the first suspect was arrested. Ryan Herbert was picked up at home. That same afternoon, Brandon Harris and Daniel Mallet were arrested while sitting at Brandon's house. The next day, Danny Holm was arrested, and his brother Joseph turned himself in at the police station. All 5 were now in custody. When Rob and Sophie arrived at the hospital, it was immediately clear how severely injured they were. Rob had 22 separate injuries. That doesn't necessarily mean he was hit 22 different times. He may have been struck repeatedly in the same spots. But in total, doctors documented 22 injuries caused by blunt force trauma. Most of the damage came from kicks to his head, which caused multiple brain hemorrhages. Rob was completely bruised, covered in blood, and his face was so swollen and disfigured that he was unrecognizable. Eventually, Rob did regain consciousness, but he was extremely confused due to the brain damage. He was restless, disoriented, and kept repeating the same things over and over again, almost like he was stuck on a loop. He behaved almost like a young child. It's heartbreaking. He kept calling for his mother repeatedly. That was one of the symptoms of the enormous pressure and damage inside his brain. Sophie, however, was in even worse condition. Her face was badly bruised. She was completely disfigured, unconscious, and there was a large wound on the side of her head above her ear where the boys had ripped locks out of her scalp with extreme force. That must have been unbelievably painful. Initially, doctors hoped that Sophie might recover, but as time passed, her condition worsened instead of improving. She remained in a coma in intensive care the entire time. Her family stayed by her side day and night, never leaving her for a second. Rob's condition, thankfully, started to improve a little over time. He remained confused though, and his recovery would take a long time. He was still completely disoriented. He also kept asking about Sophie. Not fully aware of how serious her situation was, to keep him safe, the hospital staff even laid out a mattress next to his hospital bed so that he wouldn't fall out. It eventually became clear that Rob would survive. But for Sophie, things were very different. Her brain was too severely damaged. It was clear that she would never wake up again. The entire hospital staff was devastated. The doctors and nurses had to deliver the heartbreaking news to Sophie's family and friends. Her loved ones gathered at the hospital to say their goodbyes. Sophie was taken off life support, and she passed away within 20 minutes. Even Rob got a chance to say goodbye to his girlfriend. Although he was still recovering and was in a different hospital than Sophie, he was able to visit her one final time. The next day, Rob was discharged from the hospital to continue his recovery at home. But, of course, emotionally, he was shattered, having lost his girlfriend and still having no memory of what had happened to them. Rob had absolutely no recollection of the attack. He woke up in the hospital with no idea that Sophie had died. Sophie passed away on the 24th of August 2007, 13 days after the attack. She was murdered simply because of the way she looked. At first, the police had opened the case as an assault investigation, but now it was officially a murder case. The media quickly picked up the story, and there was an enormous public outcry. People were angry, horrified, and deeply saddened. An online condolence register was opened where people could express their sympathy and support. At the skate park where the attack happened, the community laid down piles of flowers, turning the spot into a sea of tributes to honor Sophie. Among the flowers, they placed a beautiful photo of Sophie, a lasting memory of who she was. The community was deeply shocked by this horrifying hate crime. It resonated especially strongly with people who were part of alternative subcultures, those who had faced bullying and harassment themselves for being different. Sophie became the tragic example of why this kind of violence must stop, why something needs to change. An autopsy was performed on Sophie's body. She had 17 separate injuries. When they examined Sophie's brain, they found signs of oxygen deprivation and a shortage of blood flow. That oxygen deprivation likely happened while Sophie was lying unconscious on the ground, unable to breathe properly. Since she was unconscious, she couldn't control her breathing, and the lack of oxygen lasted too long. Absolutely heartbreaking. When you think back to the delay with the ambulance, it's hard not to wonder, if they had arrived sooner, would she still be alive today? We'll never know for sure, but it's painful to think about. Sophie also had 2 black eyes, a large bruise about 1.7 inches wide near her temple, and multiple wounds on her forearms from trying to protect herself. She had several bruises with visible patterns, showing they were caused by shoes. The marks clearly showed where she had been stomped and kicked. The police also thoroughly examined the crime scene, the place in the park where everything happened. They found a bottle of Lambrini cider. Ryan Herbert's fingerprints were later found on it. They also found Rob's wallet discarded in the bushes near the skate park. The boys had likely taken it from him and thrown it away while escaping. The contents were scattered and the valuables had been stolen. Search warrants were carried out at the homes of all 5 boys. Several pieces of clothing were seized for forensic testing. Blood was found on many of those clothes, and that became crucial evidence in the trial, especially to figure out who had done what. Even for witnesses, it had been hard to say exactly who was responsible for each part of the attack. It had all happened so fast, in the dark, and while the boys didn't exactly look identical, it was still challenging to pinpoint who did what. But DNA and bloodstain analysis helped fill in some of those gaps. On Brennan Harris' pants, they found Rob's blood on the left pant leg and on the inside of the leg. There was no physical evidence that Brandon had directly come into contact with Sophie, but there were plenty of witnesses who saw him attack her as well. Brandon had clearly started the entire attack and played a major role in both assaults. On Ryan Herbert's pants, as well as his socks and shoes, they found not only Rob's blood, but Sophie's blood too. Danny Holm had Rob's blood on the front of his sneaker, on the top and the tongue of the shoe. That was the only detail I could find about him, though there was likely more evidence as well. Speaking of witnesses, the police also questioned Rob Maltby himself, but Rob was still in such bad condition that he couldn't remember anything about the attack, not even the 24 hours leading up to it. He simply woke up from coma, and that's all he knew. It's unimaginable. You wake up in the hospital, disoriented, completely unaware that your girlfriend has been killed. You have no memory of the attack. For Rob, it was all one big mystery. The police spent a huge amount of time interviewing the teenagers who were there that night or nearby. In total, they gathered around 100 witnesses, all of whom were interviewed. The police even brought in younger officers for this part of the investigation because many of the teens were too scared to talk. The hope was that younger officers would help the witnesses feel safer and more comfortable speaking out. These interviews provided the police with a wealth of valuable evidence. From these statements, it became clear that Ryan, Brandon, Danny, Daniel, and Joseph had all attacked Rob and Sophie together. They were the main suspects. Most of the evidence came from witness testimonies, nearly all of whom were between 14 and 18 years old. In the end, Ryan Herbert was the only one who pled guilty to Sophie's murder. He also pled guilty to the assault on Rob. Ryan received a life sentence with a minimum of 16 years and 3 months before he'd be eligible for parole. That means after 16 years and 3 months, if he had shown good behavior, he could be released early. Because he pled guilty, his sentence was slightly lighter than Brandon's. Brandon Harris, on the other hand, did not plead guilty to Sophie's murder, but was found guilty by the jury. He did plead guilty to assaulting Rob. Brandon received 18 years to life. Brandon was later diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. There was no direct evidence that the other 3 boys had attacked Sophie, so they couldn't be convicted for her murder, but they were all convicted for assaulting Rob. All 3 pled guilty to that. Joseph and Danny Helm each received sentences of at least 5 years and 10 months in prison. Daniel Mallet received at least 4 years and 4 months. Of course, those last 3 boys have since been released. But what about Ryan and Brandon, the 2 who were most responsible for Sophie's death? Because of Ryan Herbert's good behavior in prison, his minimum sentence was reduced to 14 years and 6 months. He behaved so well in prison that authorities believed he was ready to re-enter society. So in February 2022, he was released on parole and has now been living as a free man for more than 3 years. This, understandably, deeply upset Sophie's family and friends. As for Brandon Harris, I couldn't find much information about his current status. I do know that he got into more trouble in prison a few years after his conviction. He attacked a nurse, for example. It's possible that he'll be eligible for parole, but the chances of him being granted early release are smaller because of his prison behavior. Looking back, we can carefully say that Sophie's death might have been prevented if the ambulance had arrived faster. Because Sophie wasn't placed in the recovery position after the attack, she couldn't breathe properly while unconscious. That lack of oxygen is ultimately what caused her death. Of course, I completely understand that you can't expect a 14-year-old to know how to handle that in such a high-pressure situation. But ideally, that advice should have come from the emergency operator on the phone. Still, the fact that the ambulance crew took so long, despite being less than a mile away, is something that remains incredibly painful for everyone involved. The young witnesses who called for help really did their best. But what can you expect from kids who are only 14 or 15? They simply didn't have enough experience to deal with something like this. At that age, this would be an unbelievably traumatic situation to witness. The emergency call was placed while Rob was still being attacked. Sophie hadn't even been touched yet at that point. So technically, the first call was placed fairly early, but the dispatcher couldn't quite figure out where exactly the attack was happening. The park itself was huge, and backup actually has several parks. The caller mentioned backup park, but there were multiple parks with skate parks in the area. The police ended up at the wrong skate park, and the ambulance even drove in circles for a while because they couldn't locate the scene. It's up to the emergency operator to get the clearest picture possible of where the incident is happening. But of course, the teenage caller was panicked and struggling to explain the location clearly. It's just an incredibly tragic part of the story. After Sophie's death, her family couldn't bury her immediately because the autopsy was still ongoing, so for quite some time her family couldn't say a proper goodbye or have a funeral for her. It wasn't until the 6th of November 2007 that Sophie was finally laid to rest. After her burial, many efforts began to honor Sophie's name and memory. Anyone who's part of an alternative scene was deeply shaken by what happened. Not just goths, but anyone who's ever felt like an outcast. Because many people have experienced some form of violence or bullying simply for being different. And what happened to Sophie could easily have happened to any of them. On the 26th of November, 2007, Sophie would have turned 21 years old. The night before her birthday, several bands performed at a memorial event. About 200 people attended. At midnight, all the musicians gathered on stage and called on everyone in the audience to make as much noise as possible to be heard for Sophie as a kind of protest for what had happened to Rob and Sophie, and to say that this should never happen again. Later, Rob released 21 balloons in Sophie's honor, one for each year of her life. Speaking of Rob, by some miracle, he made a complete recovery from his brain injuries. His brain fully healed, which was honestly a miracle, especially considering how badly injured he had been. Rob went back to his art studies afterward. But of course, the trauma of what happened stayed with him. On the 3rd of June 2010, Rob Maltby opened an exhibition of his artworks at a palace-like venue in Manchester. The exhibition was called Crimson Iris, The Art of Sophie, and it featured 15 paintings that Rob had created, inspired by Sophie. The money made from the exhibition went to the Sophie Lancaster Foundation. Speaking of which, that foundation still exists today. You can still donate to it. I've included the link down in the description, sophialancasterfoundation.com. The foundation was created by people who identify with Sophie's story and wanted to do something for her family. Originally, it was just a small fundraiser hoping to raise $1,000 for the family, but it grew far beyond that. To this day, the foundation is still going strong. They campaign against hate crimes and run youth programs where they teach young people about different subcultures. Their goal is to break down barriers and promote more tolerance and acceptance of people who are different. You can find the link below if you like to support the Sophie Lancaster Foundation. There has been a lot of content made about this case, plenty of documentaries, and even a film. The film is called Murdered for Being Different. It tells the full story of what happened to Sophie Lancaster. It's definitely worth watching if you want to learn more, though I will warn you, it's very heavy. But if you want a deeper understanding, I recommend watching it. This case has sparked a lot of discussions, articles, documentaries, and conversations. And it deserves that kind of attention, because what happened here was truly horrific. I found this case so disturbing. A group of boys who spotted two different-looking people sitting in a park and decided after drinking that they were going to attack them just because they looked a little unusual. This story has definitely gotten under my skin. I'm curious how it affected you. Feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. I'll be back next week with another story. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next week with another case.